On an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet suburban streets. The air was filled with the hum of distant lawnmowers and the occasional chirping of birds. It was the kind of day that felt ordinary, almost forgettable, except for Ruth Simmons, whose life was about to take an unexpected turn. Ruth had just finished attending her weekly book club meeting at the local library. The group, made up of retired teachers, writers, and lifelong learners, always left her feeling energized. That day, they'd discussed a novel about civil rights struggles in America, a topic close to Ruth's heart. As a retired Supreme Court judge, she had spent decades fighting for fairness and equality under the law. Now, at 78 years old, she enjoyed sharing her wisdom with others, even if it was just over cups of tea and butter cookies. Driving home in her modest sedan, Ruth navigated the familiar roads with ease. Her mind wandered to the characters in the book they'd discussed earlier. She thought about how far society had come since those days, and yet, how much work still remained. Shaking her head slightly, she focused back on the road ahead. She signaled carefully as she approached a four-way stop, pausing briefly before continuing onward. Everything seemed normal until suddenly, flashing blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, Ruth wasn't sure what to make of it. Had she done something wrong? She mentally retraced her steps, signaling properly, obeying speed limits, staying within her lane. Nothing stood out. But there was no denying the police cruiser pulling up behind her, its lights piercing through the calm afternoon like an unwelcome alarm. Sighing softly, Ruth pulled over to the side of the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little, tighter than usual. As she waited for the officer to approach, Ruth glanced at herself in the rearview mirror. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her glasses rested gently on her nose. She wore a simple blouse and cardigan, the kind of outfit that screamed grandmother more than anything else. Surely, she thought, this would be nothing more than a brief misunderstanding. Maybe the officer needed to check something minor, like her license or registration. Still, a small knot formed in her stomach. Years of experience had taught her that interactions like these could go either way, especially for someone who looked like her. Moments later, the driver's side door opened, and a young officer stepped out. His name tag read Harris, and his demeanor immediately set Ruth on edge. Officer Mark Harris moved with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. His sunglasses hid his eyes, making it impossible to gauge his expression. He walked up to Ruth's window, his boots clicking against the pavement, and tapped on the glass with his flashlight. Rolling down the window, Ruth greeted him politely. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. "Is there something I can help you with?" Officer Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned closer, peering into the car as though searching for something suspicious. Finally, he spoke, his tone clipped and dismissive. "Do you know why I pulled you over, ma'am?" he asked, dragging out the word ma'am in a way that made it sound almost patronizing. Ruth frowned slightly but kept her composure. "I'm not sure, officer," she replied. "I signaled at the intersection and followed all traffic rules. If there's an issue, I'd appreciate knowing what it is." Harris crossed his arms, his body language radiating skepticism. "You didn't signal when you turned onto this street," he said firmly. "That's a violation." Ruth blinked, taken aback. "I'm certain I did signal," she said calmly. "But perhaps I misunderstood your concern. May I see where I went wrong so I can correct it next time?" Instead of answering, Harris pressed on with his questioning. "How long have you been driving today?" he asked abruptly. "Are you feeling tired? Sometimes older drivers lose track of things." The comment stung, though Ruth didn't let it show. She understood that some people underestimated her because of her age, but coming from a police officer during a routine traffic stop, it felt particularly demeaning. Still, she chose her words carefully. "I've been driving safely for over 50 years, officer," she said evenly. "And I assure you, I'm quite alert." Harris didn't seem convinced. He continued to scrutinize her, his gaze lingering on the interior of her car. Ruth noticed him eyeing the small plaque on her dashboard, the one bearing the insignia of the Supreme Court. But he didn't comment on it. Instead, he shifted his attention back to her. "License and registration, please," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reaching slowly into her purse, Ruth retrieved her wallet and handed him her driver's license. Then, keeping her movements deliberate and unhurried, she reached toward the glove compartment to grab her registration. Before she could open it, however, Harris barked, "Keep your hands where I can see them." Startled, Ruth froze mid-motion. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm only getting my registration, officer," she explained, her voice steady. "It's right here in the glove compartment." For a moment, Harris hesitated. Then, with visible reluctance, he gestured for her to proceed. Ruth opened the compartment and retrieved the document, handing it over without another word. As she did, she couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was something more insidious, something rooted in assumptions and biases. Officer Harris took the documents and stepped back, retreating to his patrol car to run her information. Sitting alone in her vehicle, Ruth exhaled deeply, allowing herself a moment to process what had just happened. She knew this wasn't the first time someone had treated her unfairly because of her race or age, but it never failed to leave a bitter taste in her mouth. Still, she reminded herself of the importance of remaining composed. Escalating the situation wouldn't solve anything, and besides, she had faced far worse challenges in her lifetime. As she waited, Ruth glanced at the plaque on her dashboard once more. It was a small reminder of the battles she'd fought and won, both in courtrooms and beyond. Though she was no longer on the bench, her legacy endured, and she hoped that someday stories like this one would become relics of the past rather than realities of the present. Little did she know, this encounter was far from over, and its ripple effects would soon reach far beyond the confines of this quiet suburban street. As Ruth sat in her car, waiting for Officer Harris to return with her documents, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her shoulders. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the road and painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. But the beauty of the evening was lost on Ruth. Her mind raced with thoughts about how quickly a mundane day could spiral into something unsettling. Officer Harris stood by his patrol car, flipping through Ruth's license and registration. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched tightly as he studied the information. Despite his outward confidence, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Something about this elderly woman didn't add up. She wasn't behaving like the people he usually encountered during traffic stops. No nervous fidgeting, no raised voices, no attempts to argue or plead innocence. Instead, she exuded calmness, almost as if she were observing him rather than the other way around. Curiosity finally got the better of him. As he glanced at her driver's license again, his eyes narrowed slightly. The name Ruth Simmons seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Shaking off the thought, he decided to dig deeper. He walked back to Ruth's car, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the road. This time, when he approached her window, his tone carried a hint of forced politeness, masking the suspicion that still lingered beneath the surface. "Ms. Simmons," he began, leaning one hand on the roof of her car while holding her documents in the other. "Can you tell me where you're coming from today?" Ruth looked up at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I was at a book club meeting at the local library," she replied matter-of-factly. Her voice remained steady, betraying none of the frustration simmering inside her. "We meet every Tuesday afternoon to discuss literature." Harris nodded slowly, though his skepticism was evident. "And what kind of books do you read?" he asked, his question laced with an undercurrent of disbelief. It was clear he wasn't interested in her literary preferences. He was probing, trying to find inconsistencies in her story. "We were discussing a novel about civil rights struggles in America," Ruth answered calmly. "It's a topic I've always been passionate about." She paused for a moment, then added, I imagine you've heard of some of the landmark cases related to equality and justice. Her words hung in the air between them, sharp yet subtle. For a brief second, Harris seemed taken aback, as if unsure how to respond. Then, regaining his composure, he shifted gears. "Do you always carry around plaques like the one on your dashboard?" he asked, nodding toward the small emblem bearing the insignia of the Supreme Court. Ruth followed his gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "That plaque has been with me for many years," she said softly. "It serves as a reminder of my commitment to fairness and the rule of law." Harris frowned, clearly unimpressed. "Fairness and the law, huh?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. He straightened up, tapping the documents against his palm. "Well, Miss Simmons, let's see if everything checks out." He returned to his patrol car once more, leaving Ruth alone with her thoughts. Sitting there, she reflected on the absurdity of the situation. Here she was, a retired Supreme Court judge, someone who had dedicated her life to interpreting and upholding the law, being scrutinized by a young officer who seemed determined to find fault where none existed. It was ironic, even maddening, but Ruth refused to let anger consume her. Instead, she focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her. It was about countless others who faced similar indignities without the privilege of her title or experience. Back in his cruiser, Harris ran Ruth's information through the system. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Her license was valid, her registration current, and her insurance fully paid. But something nagged at him. He pulled up additional records, searching for anything that might explain why this seemingly ordinary woman felt so different. That's when he stumbled upon it. A headline from years ago, buried deep in the archives of online news articles. The words leapt off the screen. "Retired Justice Ruth Simmons reflects on legacy of equality." His heart skipped a beat. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. The name, the plaque, the composed demeanor. It all made sense now. Ruth Simmons wasn't just any elderly black woman driving home from a book club meeting. She was a former Supreme Court judge, a trailblazer who had shattered barriers and fought tirelessly for justice throughout her career. For a moment, Harris sat frozen, staring at the screen. Panic bubbled up inside him. How had he not recognized her sooner? What would happen when word got out that he'd pulled over and treated with suspicion one of the most respected figures in American legal history? Outside, Ruth watched as Harris emerged from his patrol car once again. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by visible discomfort. He approached her window cautiously, his movement slower and less certain than before. When he spoke, his voice lacked its previous edge. Ms. Simmons," he began awkwardly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Ruth arched an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "A misunderstanding?" she echoed, her tone neutral, but tinged with quiet authority. "Yes," Harris stammered, avoiding eye contact. "Your documents check out fine. Everything's in order." He hesitated, then added hastily, "I apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused." The apology felt hollow, delivered more out of obligation than genuine remorse. Ruth studied him for a moment, her piercing gaze cutting through his facade. She could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he had overstepped. But instead of confronting him directly, she chose to let the silence speak for itself. Finally, she broke the tension with a simple nod. "Thank you, officer," she said evenly. "I trust we can both learn from this experience." Harris nodded stiffly, handing back her documents. "Have a safe drive home, ma'am," he mumbled, stepping aside to allow her to leave. As Ruth rolled up her window and started her car, she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Anger, disappointment, and sadness swirled within her, tempered only by the resolve she had carried throughout her life. This encounter was far from unique. It was a reflection of the biases and prejudices that persisted in society, often hidden behind badges and uniforms. Yet it also underscored the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice, no matter how daunting the circumstances. Pulling away from the curb, Ruth glanced in her rearview mirror one last time. Officer Harris stood by his patrol car, watching her go. Whether he truly understood the gravity of what had transpired or whether he would simply file it away as another routine stop remained to be seen. But for Ruth, the incident was far from over. It was a spark, igniting a fire within her to continue fighting for change, one small act of courage at a time. As Ruth drove away from the scene of the traffic stop, the weight of what had just happened settled over her like a heavy blanket. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the road and painting everything in shades of amber and gold. But Ruth barely noticed the beauty around her. Her mind replayed every detail of the encounter. The condescending tone, the unwarranted suspicion, the moment Officer Harris realized who she was. It wasn't anger that consumed her, though there was certainly some of that. Instead, it was a deep sadness mixed with frustration and resolve. She gripped the steering wheel tightly as memories flooded back, not just of this incident, but of countless others throughout her life. Growing up in a small southern town during the era of segregation, Ruth had learned early on what it meant to be judged not for who you were but for how you looked. She remembered walking miles to attend a segregated school while white children rode buses past her. She thought about the whispered insults and outright discrimination she faced when she first stepped into courtrooms as one of the few black women lawyers. And now, decades later, here she was again, still fighting the same battles, still proving herself over and over. By the time Ruth pulled into her driveway, the emotions swirling inside her had crystallized into determination. This wasn't just about her. It was about all the people without her platform or privilege, the ones who didn't have the luxury of being recognized after their dignity had been stripped away. As she parked her car and stepped out, she made a silent promise to herself. This wouldn't end here. Something had to change, and if anyone could spark that change, it was her. Inside her cozy home, Ruth settled into her favorite chair by the window. A soft breeze drifted through the curtains, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers from her garden. On the table beside her sat a stack of notebooks and pens, a writer's tools, always within reach. Ruth picked up a pen and began to write, her handwriting neat and deliberate. At first the words flowed slowly, each sentence carefully chosen, but soon they came pouring out like water released from a dam. The letter started simply enough. "To whom it may concern," she wrote. Then, she recounted the events of the day, describing the traffic stop in vivid detail. She didn't embellish or exaggerate. There was no need. The truth alone carried its own power. She explained how Officer Harris had pulled her over under questionable pretenses, questioned her unnecessarily, and treated her with thinly veiled disdain. She described the moment he returned to his patrol car, only to discover her identity, and how his demeanor shifted instantly once he realized who she was. But Ruth didn't stop there. She knew that pointing fingers at one officer wouldn't solve the larger problem. So she broadened her focus, addressing the systemic issues that allowed such encounters to happen in the first place. She wrote about implicit bias, the assumptions people make based on race, age, and appearance. She talked about the fear that grips marginalized communities every time they see flashing lights in their rearview mirrors. And she challenged the police department, not just to investigate this specific incident, but to take meaningful steps toward reform. "Justice begins within your ranks," she concluded. "If we are ever to achieve true equality, we must start by holding ourselves accountable. Training programs, community engagement, transparency, these are not luxuries. They are necessities. Please do not let this moment pass without action." When she finished writing, Ruth leaned back in her chair and reread the letter. Each word resonated with her deeply, capturing not only her personal experience, but also the collective struggle of so many others. Satisfied, she signed her name at the bottom. Ruth Simmons, retired Justice, U.S. Supreme Court. The next morning, Ruth sent the letter to the local police department. She also shared it with a trusted friend, a journalist who had covered her career for years. Within hours, the story began to spread. The journalist published an article detailing Ruth's account, complete with quotes from her letter and reflections on her storied career. Social media lit up with reactions as people expressed outrage, admiration, and solidarity. Hashtags like Chicha Justice for All and Orowing Stand with Ruth trended online, drawing attention to the broader conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying Ruth's voice far beyond her quiet suburban neighborhood. Television anchors discussed her letter during evening broadcasts, framing it as both a personal indictment of Officer Harris's actions and a call to action for law enforcement agencies nationwide. Talk show hosts invited legal experts and civil rights advocates onto their programs to debate the implications of the incident. Some praised Ruth for using her platform to highlight systemic injustice, while others criticized her for making a big deal out of a routine traffic stop. But amidst the noise, one thing was clear: Ruth's letter had struck a nerve. Back in her hometown, the fallout was immediate. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Bias-free policing now," and "Respect our elders, respect our community." Local activists organized rallies and town hall meetings, demanding answers from officials about how such incidents could be prevented in the future. Meanwhile, the police chief issued a public statement acknowledging receipt of Ruth's letter and promising a thorough investigation into the matter. He announced plans to suspend Officer Harris pending further review and vowed to implement new training initiatives focused on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Despite the growing attention, Ruth remained grounded. She declined most interview requests, preferring to let her letter speak for itself. But privately, she felt a sense of cautious optimism. For years, she had fought for justice in courtrooms and boardrooms, often feeling like progress moved at a glacial pace. Now seeing ordinary citizens rallying around this cause reminded her of the power of collective action. Change might be slow, but it was possible, and sometimes all it took was one moment, one story to ignite a movement. That evening, Ruth sat in her study, flipping through old photo albums. She paused at a picture of herself standing on the steps of the Supreme Court, surrounded by colleagues and friends. In that image, she looked younger, more vibrant, but the fire in her eyes was the same. It was a reminder that the fight for equality wasn't confined to any single chapter of her life. It was a lifelong commitment, passed down from generation to generation. As she closed the album and set it aside, Ruth smiled softly to herself. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, filled with resistance and setbacks. But she had faced worse before, and she would face it again. Because in the end, justice wasn't just a job, it was a calling, and Ruth Simmons had answered hers long ago. The days following the traffic stop passed quickly, but for Ruth Simmons they felt like both a blur and an eternity. The whirlwind of attention her letter had sparked was overwhelming at times, yet she handled it with the same grace and poise that had defined her career. Every morning she woke up to find her inbox flooded with emails, from strangers thanking her for speaking out, from activists inviting her to speak at rallies, and even from fellow retirees sharing their own stories of discrimination. Each message reinforced what she already knew. This wasn't just about her. It was about a system that needed fixing. Ruth spent hours each day responding thoughtfully to these messages, knowing how important it was to acknowledge the voices reaching out to her. She typed slowly but deliberately, choosing her words with care. "Thank you for sharing your story," she wrote to one woman who described being pulled over repeatedly despite having done nothing wrong. "Your courage inspires me, and I hope we can work together to create a world where no one has to feel afraid behind the wheel." Her mornings were filled with these exchanges, but by afternoon, Ruth turned her focus inward. Sitting in her study, surrounded by shelves lined with books on law, history, and social justice, she began reflecting deeply on the incident. What could she do next? How could she ensure that this moment became more than just another headline? These questions weighed heavily on her, but they also energized her. At 78 years old, Ruth still believed in the power of action, and she wasn't ready to step aside just yet. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Ruth decided to revisit her letter. She read it again, line by line, searching for any gaps or areas where she might have fallen short. While the letter had resonated with many, she realized there was still more to say, more context, more nuance, more humanity. So she picked up her pen once more and started drafting a follow-up piece. This time she focused less on the specifics of the traffic stop and more on its broader implications. In this new essay, Ruth shared personal anecdotes from her life, weaving them into a larger narrative about systemic racism and inequality. She wrote about growing up in a segregated town, attending schools that lacked basic resources while white children enjoyed state-of-the-art facilities nearby. She recounted the countless times she'd been underestimated or dismissed because of her race and gender, whether it was during her early days as a lawyer or later as a judge. And she spoke candidly about the toll such experiences took, not just on individuals but on entire communities. But Ruth didn't stop at recounting hardships. She also highlighted moments of triumph, reminding readers that progress, however slow, was possible. She described landmark cases she'd worked on, policies she'd helped shape, and young lawyers she'd mentored who were now leading movements of their own. Her tone was hopeful, urging people not to lose faith even when the road ahead seemed impossibly long. When the essay was finished, Ruth shared it widely. It appeared in newspapers, magazines, and online platforms, drawing praise from all corners. Readers commented on how relatable and powerful her words were, saying they felt seen and understood in ways they hadn't before. For many, Ruth's ability to blend vulnerability with strength made her message all the more impactful. As the weeks went by, invitations poured in for Ruth to speak publicly about her experiences. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking had never been her favorite activity. It required energy she sometimes didn't feel she had, but she eventually agreed to participate in a few events. The first was a panel discussion hosted by a local university, where she joined civil rights leaders, academics, and community organizers to talk about policing reform. Dressed in a simple blouse and skirt, Ruth walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Though she smiled warmly, her expression carried the weight of someone who understood the stakes of the conversation. During the discussion, Ruth listened intently as others shared their perspectives. When it was her turn to speak, she leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "We must remember," she began, "that real change doesn't happen overnight. It requires patience, persistence, and most importantly, unity. We cannot afford to let divisions weaken us, not when so much is at stake." She went on to emphasize the importance of listening to marginalized voices, particularly those who didn't have platforms like hers. "Too often," she said, "we hear only the loudest voices in the room. But true progress comes when we amplify the quiet ones, the people living on the front lines of injustice whose daily realities demand our attention." Her words resonated deeply with the audience, sparking standing ovations and heartfelt discussions afterward. Many attendees approached her personally, thanking her for putting into words what they had struggled to articulate themselves. One young man, barely out of college, told Ruth he wanted to pursue a career in law because of her example. Tears welled in his eyes as he shook her hand, promising to carry forward the fight for equality. Encouraged by the response, Ruth continued accepting invitations to speak at conferences, schools, and community centers. Wherever she went, she brought the same message: that justice wasn't just a destination, it was a journey. Along the way, she also mentored aspiring lawyers and activists, offering guidance and encouragement whenever she could. Whether it was reviewing a draft of a legal brief or simply sharing advice over coffee, Ruth invested her time generously, believing wholeheartedly in the next generation's potential to drive change. Despite the spotlight, Ruth remained humble. She declined offers to write a memoir or star in documentaries, insisting that her story wasn't the point. What mattered most, she argued, was the collective effort to dismantle systems of oppression and build something better in their place. Still, she couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment, knowing that her actions had inspired others to take a stand. By the time autumn arrived, the leaves turning fiery shades of red and orange, Ruth's influence had rippled far beyond her small town. Activists across the country cited her letter and essays as catalysts for renewed conversations about police accountability and racial bias. Law enforcement agencies began implementing reforms, albeit slowly and imperfectly. Community organizations launched campaigns to educate citizens about their rights during traffic stops. Even politicians referenced Ruth's words during debates, pledging to prioritize criminal justice reform if elected. Through it all, Ruth stayed rooted in her values. She attended local meetings, volunteered at community centers, and continued mentoring young people. Though she knew the battle against systemic racism wouldn't end anytime soon, she found solace in the knowledge that she was doing her part. Every letter she wrote, every speech she gave, every person she encouraged, it all added up to something meaningful. Late one evening, as Ruth sat by the fireplace sipping tea, she reflected on everything that had transpired since that fateful traffic stop. The memory of Officer Harris's dismissive tone still stung, but it no longer held the same power over her. Instead, it served as a reminder of why she kept fighting, for herself, for her community, and for future generations. Setting down her cup, Ruth glanced at the plaque on her mantel, the one bearing the insignia of the Supreme Court. It was a symbol of where she had been, yes, but also of where she hoped society could go. With a contented sigh, she rose from her chair and turned off the lights, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The months following Ruth Simmons' traffic stop transformed not only her life, but also the lives of countless others who found inspiration in her courage. What began as a single moment of injustice had grown into a movement, sparking conversations that reached far beyond her small suburban town. For Ruth, this wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about dismantling the systems and biases that allowed such encounters to happen in the first place. As winter approached, Ruth's days were filled with activity. She traveled frequently, speaking at conferences, universities, and community centers across the country. Each event brought new faces, new stories, and new opportunities to connect with people from all walks of life. Despite her age, Ruth carried herself with remarkable energy, driven by the belief that every interaction mattered. Whether she was addressing a packed auditorium or sitting quietly with a group of students, she listened intently, offering wisdom gained from decades of fighting for justice. One particular evening stood out in her memory. It was a chilly night in Chicago, where Ruth had been invited to deliver the keynote address at a civil rights gala. The venue was elegant, a grand ballroom adorned with sparkling chandeliers and rows of neatly arranged tables. As Ruth stepped onto the stage, dressed in a deep blue dress that complemented her silver hair, the room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, moved by the presence of someone who had become a symbol of resilience and dignity. Ruth waited patiently for the applause to subside before beginning her speech. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a warmth that instantly captivated the audience. "Thank you," she said softly, pausing to smile at the sea of faces before her. "I stand here tonight not because I am extraordinary, but because ordinary people like me and like you have the power to create change." She went on to share her story, weaving together threads of personal experience and broader societal challenges. She spoke about the traffic stop, describing how it had reminded her of the persistent inequalities faced by marginalized communities. But rather than dwell on anger or frustration, she focused on hope and action. "We cannot erase the past," she said firmly, "but we can shape the future. Every step forward begins with a choice: to speak up, to listen, to act." Her words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement or wiped away tears. After her speech, dozens of attendees lined up to thank her personally. Some shared their own experiences of discrimination, while others expressed gratitude for her leadership. One young woman, clutching a notebook filled with scribbled notes, told Ruth she planned to pursue a career in law inspired by her example. "You've shown us that no matter our age or background, we can make a difference," the woman said earnestly. Back home, Ruth continued working tirelessly to amplify voices often overlooked in discussions about justice. She partnered with local organizations to host workshops aimed at educating citizens about their rights during interactions with law enforcement. These sessions weren't just lectures. They were interactive dialogues designed to empower participants with knowledge and confidence. Ruth encouraged attendees to ask questions, share concerns, and brainstorm solutions together. In addition to her advocacy work, Ruth turned her attention to mentoring young activists and lawyers. She opened her home to them, hosting informal gatherings where they could discuss strategies, swap ideas, and seek advice. Over cups of tea and slices of homemade pie, Ruth listened attentively, offering guidance without ever imposing her views. "Your voice matters," she would remind them. "Never underestimate the impact of speaking your truth." Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Ruth's actions continued spreading outward. Police departments nationwide began revisiting their policies, implementing reforms aimed at reducing bias and improving community relations. Mandatory training programs on cultural sensitivity became standard practice in many areas, while transparency initiatives sought to rebuild trust between officers and residents. Though progress remained uneven, these changes signaled a shift, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and strive for something better. Media coverage played a significant role in amplifying Ruth's message. Journalists highlighted her efforts, framing her as a beacon of hope in turbulent times. Documentaries explored her legacy, showcasing interviews with colleagues, friends, and mentees who attested to her unwavering commitment to equality. Social media buzzed with hashtags celebrating her contributions, ensuring her story reached audiences around the globe. Despite the accolades, Ruth remained grounded. She declined awards and honors, redirecting attention to grassroots movements and unsung heroes working tirelessly behind the scenes. "This isn't about me," she insisted whenever someone praised her publicly. "It's about all of us coming together to build a fairer, kinder world." By spring, signs of renewal were everywhere. In the budding flowers outside Ruth's window and in the growing momentum for change within society. Activists organized marches, rallies, and voter registration drives, channeling outrage into action. Community leaders collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation addressing systemic racism and police accountability. Even schools incorporated lessons about Ruth's story into their curricula, teaching students about the importance of standing up against injustice. For Ruth, seeing this collective effort unfold was both humbling and heartening. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she also believed in humanity's capacity for growth. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she often reminded those who sought her counsel. "But if we keep pushing, keep believing, we'll get there." On a quiet afternoon in late April, Ruth sat in her garden surrounded by blooming tulips and the sweet scent of lilacs. A gentle breeze rustled the pages of a book resting on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in some time. Instead, she gazed thoughtfully at the horizon, reflecting on everything that had transpired since that fateful day months earlier. The traffic stop had been humiliating, yes, but it had also been transformative. It reminded Ruth of the battles still left to fight and the responsibility she bore as someone with privilege and influence. More importantly, it reaffirmed her faith in the power of storytelling. By sharing her experience, she had given others permission to do the same, creating a tapestry of voices united by a common desire for justice. As the sun dipped below the trees, casting golden light across the yard, Ruth felt a profound sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she trusted that the seeds planted during the season of activism would continue to grow. With a contented sigh, she closed her book and rose from her chair, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. For Ruth Simmons, the journey wasn't over. It never truly was. But each step forward brought her closer to the world she envisioned. One defined not by prejudice and division, but by compassion, understanding, and equality. And as long as there were hearts willing to dream and hands ready to act, she knew that vision was within reach.